One day I came across a picture of my second great-grandfather's gravestone. He was inscribed with his military rank and regiment, and I didn't even know he'd been to war. All I knew about Nye Gentry was that he'd been a grumpy, contrary old farmer who passed away long before I was born. But besides being a soldier, he'd married, raised and supported his family on a small farm, and as a child I knew one of his sons, my great-grandfather. I decided I really needed to know more about Nye's story. I learned that at 22 years old, about 9 months after the Civil War started, Nye joined a newly formed regiment of men in his local area. His younger brother Jefferson and older brother Albert joined with him. One of them would die in the war, and the other would be captured. Now, whether it was patriotism, adventure, a need to make their own mark, or they just wanted to get out of town, he and his brothers chose to leave their long-established family farm and go to war. The 800 soldiers of his original regiment were friends, neighbors, relatives, and brothers. They attended the local Baptist church together, they traded with each other, they helped each other in time of need. They couldn't possibly have understood the years of brutality and death that they witnessed and participated in. Both sides expected a short war, but for Abraham Lincoln's determination, it would have been. Making things harder, a few months after they left, their dad passed away. His mom, 2 sisters, and 2 younger brothers remained to hold the farm down. A mere 4 months after signing up, they found themselves in the middle of the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. Much of that fighting included hand-to-hand combat, sometimes in dense underbrush on uneven terrain. Artillery fire added to the noise, confusion, and mayhem. It really was a trial by fire. Nye, a private, saw friends and neighbors fall, shot through by enemy fire, blown up by artillery. Men next to him died in an instant. In 2 days, Nye's regiment alone lost over 100 soldiers, friends, family, and neighbors all. That 2-day battle shattered any illusion to the romance of war Nye, his brothers, or his fellow servicemen may have had. More Americans died in those 2 days than in any war on the American continent up to that date. This battle included a total of 110,000 soldiers, with 23,000 killed, wounded, missing, or captured between the two sides. The instruments of death were muskets, early rifles, bayonets, and cannonballs. And it's sad to say that dubious record didn't stand. Union General Grant won, but he was vilified for being caught unprepared. Abraham Lincoln defended him, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Lincoln had some issues with generals that didn't want to get their hands dirty. Time and time again, Nye and his regiment engaged in battle, losing men all around them. Remnants of other decimated regiments filled in as replacements. But the South's defeat at the Battle of Shiloh allowed the Union to advance to the critical Mississippi River. As an aside, having walked and visited Gettysburg, Antietam, Montgomery, and other eastern battlefields that our ancestors fought on, I always considered the war in our now Midwest as more of a footnote. But researching Nye, I learned that was far from the truth. Because whoever controlled the Mississippi River controlled the free flow of military personnel, material, and trade in what was then Western United States. And President Lincoln considered the Mississippi River a strategic imperative. Now, Nye spent some time in Vicksburg before being transferred to Port Hudson, and the Siege of Port Hudson was likely the most trying of all of his engagements. This port, or really ford, was placed along the Mississippi north of Baton Rouge for the sole purpose of denying the Union Army use of the Mississippi. It wasn't as famous as Vicksburg, but it was just important. At the start of that siege, on May 23rd, the South only held Vicksburg and Port Hudson against the North completely controlling the strategic Mississippi. The Confederates had built up a substantial and well-designed, well-fortified defense at Port Hudson to keep the blockade of the Mississippi. Guns were placed on bluffs as much as 80 feet above the river. They'd sighted in the distances before the Union arrived. The South had also expected a long battle and had prepared well. They were well supplied with plenty of food and ammunition, though they could have used more meat. When battle ensued, the Union Army quickly learned that the Confederates would not be easily removed. So began a 46-day siege, with the Union amassing some 40,000 troops and several ships against roughly 8,000 Confederates. The Union also transferred numerous large guns from further downriver. There's still questions about how many Confederates were at the port at the start of the siege, so I'm going with 8,000. Now, there's some evidence that Nye served as a messenger in this engagement, so he would have been tasked with passing orders between batteries and companies and getting updates back to commanders. With a constant threat posed by sharpshooters and regular bombing, this is an exceptionally hazardous job. And by moving about the entire encampment, he would have been witness to the results of those bombing attacks, flying bullets, and other engagements brought on by the other side. And sometimes he had to work his way over piles of bodies to complete his duty. Day after day, both sides kept the other under near continual threat with bombardment, sharpshooters, and unpredictable attacks. Nothing dislodged the Confederates or seemed to discourage the North. As the siege at Port Hudson continued, the siege at Vicksburg also continued, and President Lincoln reiterated that the entirety of the Mississippi had to be taken. Port Hudson turned into a murderous stalemate, with one side raining death and destruction down on the other. Summer in the deep South brought disease-carrying bugs. Both sides suffered losses to malaria and other diseases, with an estimated 10% of forces being lost this way alone. Now, the Confederates had prepared for a long battle, but they couldn't predict a siege lasting well into a second month, with active struggle nearly every day. Nye likely saw history, though I'm sure he didn't realize it was history at the time. The 1st South Carolina Volunteers and the 3rd Louisiana Guard, black regiments, saw their first battle at Milliken's Bend at Port Hudson, fighting beside white units. Before this, they had been limited to guard duty and other mundane but necessary military tasks. But like all other direct attacks on the port, this one was unsuccessful. The black regiments acquitted themselves well, and their bravery became somewhat legendary. Disgracefully, when a truce was called to remove the dead, the Confederates refused to allow the blacks to be cleared. They promised to shoot anyone that removed a black body. And even worse, those dead lay in the field rotting in the summer heat until the port was surrendered. As a side note, as many as 180,000 blacks served in the Union Army, and they seldom get the credit they deserved. But on July 4th, the Confederates at Port Hudson learned that Vicksburg had fallen. They knew no relief or resupply was coming. They also realized the Union could bring even more troops and guns to the battle. By then, the Confederates were running low on ammunition and food. They were even eating rats, horses, and mules. But the fact that they were still standing after what had become the longest siege in U.S. history spoke to their preparation and their tenacity. The port wasn't taken by force. Understanding the impossibility of their situation, Major General Frank Gardner surrendered on July 9, 1863, to Union General Nathaniel Banks. The surviving 6,300 Confederate soldiers, including Nye and his brother, became prisoners of war. The Union lost over 5,000 men killed or wounded, plus a similar number lost to disease. And on the Confederate side, somewhere between 750 and 1,500 were killed or wounded, and about the same number were dead from disease as well. The Union also lost several warships and failed attempts to break the blockade. Being privates, Nye and his brother Jefferson Lee were given parole after a few days. There was a general rule that paroled soldiers on either side were not allowed to return to service unless exchanged for another enemy soldier. And parole was far better than being taken to a POW camp on either side, where mistreatment, disease, and malnutrition often ruled. But according to regiment history, these paroled soldiers were exchanged. After that harrowing experience, they were given some rest at Cahaba, where their unit was again reconstituted with remnants of other units. And the brothers continued their service. On the home front, the family endured as well as they could. In 1863, Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith said, "The common folk are tired of fighting. They simply want the boys to come home." And by 1863, Confederate currency was worth a quarter of what the U.S. dollar was and was dropping. Salt was a highest priced item. It was a prime necessity, running from $1 to $5 a pound if you could even find it. The reason salt was so important is before refrigeration, salt was used to preserve meat. It was an absolutely critical thing to preserve foods. The Federal armies burned houses, tore down fences, stole food, livestock, wagons, weapons. They took household silver and anything else of value that they could find in the South. In a war-ravaged county like his, communication was nearly non-existent. Sometime in 1864, Nye's family believed he died in the war. They erected a memorial to him in the town cemetery, which oddly stands today. They fought more losing battles, including the retreat from Chickamauga to Atlanta. They lost half their officers and men at that time. They participated in the pointless defense of Atlanta as Sherman got his march to the sea going that resulted in even more regimental losses. But they held out until the end of the war, surrendering in Greensburg, North Carolina on March 31st, 1865. Not knowing what to expect when they got home, Nye and his brother walked hundreds of miles through the war-torn South, subsisting on the kindness of others. I'm sure they had plenty of time to reflect on the devastation and destruction they witnessed and participated in on that slow walk home. I wonder what conclusions they drew. Now, there's no record that Nye's family owned slaves. It appears their small farm provided for the family and provided for some trade goods. In all, these war-hardened brothers and his regiment had seen countless significant engagements over 4 grueling years, and nearly every one of them was a loss for the Confederacy. In a sad stat, only 50 of the original 800 men of his regiment could be accounted for at the end of the war. But 2 of the 3 brothers had stuck together, and they survived. The other brother, Albert Gallatin, died before fighting a battle. He succumbed to disease in the training camp, which was a common occurrence. There is family lore that their dad, Nye Gentry, and a neighbor went together to retrieve their respective sons' bodies from the training camp. However, the coffins were not individually marked and were mixed up on the train. The grieving dads couldn't figure out whose belonged to who, so they agreed to each take one and accept them as their own. So we'll never really know if his body is buried under its marker. If Nye thought life would get better after the war, he was wrong. The county he called home bordered Tennessee and Georgia and changed hands between the warring factions at least 3 times. Union General Sherman and his 15th Corps wintered in Jackson County, Nye's home, over the winter of 1863-1864. And according to a Union account, they located at different points around the county, and Sherman went north to vacation for a few weeks, consigning his army to Logan's hands. The Union soldiers wintered in new uniforms, in good houses, with much revelry. Foraging was easy and often not dangerous. Now that's a great example of the winners writing history books, a Confederate-leaning resident's point of view. Invaded by the Union for the second time, thousands of well-rested, well-outfitted, and armed soldiers took their leave of anything they wanted. They confiscated homes to live in as they chose. And they often forced women of those houses to cook, clean, and take care of often drunk soldiers. Children were consigned to servile tasks at the soldiers' whims. and sometimes their demands were too frightening to write here. Whatever horses and livestock and farm tools remained were taken as spoils of war. Sometimes as retribution or just for fun, a home or barn would be burnt to the ground. By the time Sherman left to take Atlanta and marched to the sea, the county and surrounding areas were ravaged and desolate. Only old men, women, and children survived on the land, and precious few crops were planted that spring. Though the main army left, a garrison remained to control the rail lines, river landings, and salt pepper mines. So skirmishes and fights continued, further destroying whatever remained. When Nye and his brother got home, they saw nothing but devastation. Everything the family and community had built over a lifetime burnt, taken, or destroyed. But his mother and siblings survived, and the land remained. Now, it's not my purpose here to defend or judge the choices they and millions of others on both sides made over 150 years ago. I'll share more about his tumultuous life after the war in another video, how they rebuilt their lives after the war, and how he moved to Oklahoma and lived until 1913. And thank you for watching, and when the second video is ready, I'll have something up here you can click on. Thanks so much for watching.